Gross Economic Product or GDP and Labor Force, 1960 to 1980, the Ferdinand Marcos dictatorial administration. In 1965, Ferdinand Marcos won the presidential election and became the 10th president of the Philippines. His first term was marked with increased industrialization and the creation of solid infrastructures nationwide, such as the North Luzon Expressway and the Maharlika Highway. Marcos did this by appointing a cabinet composed mostly of technocrats and intellectuals, by increasing funding to the armed forces and mobilizing them to help in construction. Marcos also established schools and learning institutions nationwide, more than the combined total of those established by his predecessors. Gross Economic Product. In the 1960s, when South Korea was a land of peasants, the Philippines was one of Asia's industrial powerhouses. It produced consumer goods, processed raw materials, and had assembly plants for automobiles, television, and home appliances. Chemical plants produced drugs. Scrap metal was imported and made into steel for ships, and factories produced cement, textiles, and fertilizer. The GDP in agriculture, fishery, and forestry. The GDP growth rate from 1961 to 1965 at 5.23%. In agriculture, the rate of growth in the past 2 years averaged 6%, which exceeds the target of 4% in the program. As you can see in the graph from 1960, it increasing until to his highest peak of the graph, which is 1990. This shows that when Marcos began his early presidency, our GDP in agriculture begins to rise. Prior to 1970, Philippine exports consisted mainly of agricultural or mineral products in raw or minimally processed form. In the 1970s, the country began to export manufactured commodities, especially garments and electronic components, and the prices of some traditional exports declined. By 1988, non-traditional exports comprise 75% of the total value of goods shipped abroad. GDP in manufacturing. We examine also the GDP in manufacturing based on the data we came up with this graph in your screen. This is the graph of manufacturing during Marcos' presidency. We found out that GDP in manufacturing in 1960 to 1990 was impressive, and it is increasing. In manufacturing, the target increase was 7.1%. The actual increase has been placed at 8.7%. We have increased per capita income. In terms of real national income, the preliminary estimates show an increase of 5.4% against the goal of only 5%. The early part of Marcos' administration continued the rising growth rate which characterized the previous administrations of the Third Philippine Republic, peaking at nearly 9% in 1973 and 1976. However, Marcos' later years in power saw the worst recession in Philippine history, with the economy contracting by 7.3% in 1984 and 1985. In September 1972, Marcos declared martial law, claiming that it was the last defense against the rising disorder caused by increasingly violent student demonstrations, the alleged threats of communist insurgency by the new Communist Party of the Philippines, or CPP, and the Muslim separatist movement of the Moro National Liberation Front, or also known as MNLF. Labor force. During the 1960s, up to the declaration of martial law, the Philippine economy was primarily agricultural, with 60% of the labor force working in 1957 and 1964. So this is the labor force in agriculture, fishery, and forestry. The rapid growth of labor force in agriculture, fishery, and forestry has a total of 10.7 million in April 1962. The labor force grew to about 11.2 million in May 1963. The half of a million labor force represent a 4.6% of the year. That's why the graph shows how it increased rapidly. The growth can be attributed wholly to the rise of employed people, about to 19.7 million to 10.3 million. Agriculture, which had provided most employment, employed only approximately 45% of the workforce in 1990, down from 60% in 1960. Manufacturing industry was not able to make up the difference. Manufacturing's share of employed people remained stable at about 12% in 1990. We have now the total employed labor force. Population growth averaged 2.9% from 1965 to 1980 and 2.5% in the late 1980s. While more than 40% of the population was below 15 years of age, the growth of the working age population, those 15 years of age and older, was even more rapid than total population growth. In the 1980s, the working age population grew by 2.7% annually. In addition, the labor force participation rate, the proportion of working age people who were in the labor force, rose approximately 5 percentage points during the 1980s, largely because of the increase in the proportion of women entering the workforce. So the actual labor force grew up by 750,000 people, or approximately 4% each year during the 1980s. From 1960 to 1990, the graph shows, as what you have seen, that every year has an increase of labor force and the employment also increases, which had averaged about 4.5% every year. So that would be all.